The courtroom was tense, heavy with expectation, when Representative Jasmine Crockett found herself at the center of a judicial power play. A Texas judge, clearly displeased by her relentless advocacy and unflinching voice, slapped her with a $15,000 fine. The move reeked of an attempt to silence her, to box her in with bureaucracy and intimidation. But Crockett didn't flinch. Within seconds, she flipped the script, turning what was meant to be a punishment into a rallying cry, and a stunning political counterpunch. The fine wasn't just about money. It was symbolic, a clear attempt to suppress a voice that had become increasingly inconvenient to those in power. Crockett had been gaining national traction for her sharp interrogation skills and unshakable poise during congressional hearings. Her style, precise, informed, and unafraid, had drawn praise from progressives and ire from opponents. The judge's fine came at a time when her influence was rising, suggesting it was less about protocol and more about power. But if the fine was meant to quiet her, it had the opposite effect. Crockett wasted no time in responding. Rather than grovel or backpedal, she stepped up with a counterstrike that stunned even her critics. She took to social media and issued a bold public statement, not only defending her position, but exposing the political motivations behind the judge's actions. With clarity and confidence, she reframed the fine, not as a disciplinary measure but as proof of the systemic efforts to stifle dissent, especially from strong black women in positions of authority. In a matter of hours, Crockett turned the $15,000 fine into a lightning rod for national attention. She garnered massive support online, with thousands of followers and activists rallying behind her. Donations began pouring in, not just to help with the fine, but to fund her continued fight against what she called the weaponization of legal systems to silence truth-tellers. What started as a punitive act morphed into a high-profile moment of resistance, and Crockett was at the center of it. More importantly, her response revealed something deeper, a refusal to be bullied, even by the gavel. It was about principle. Crockett made it clear that elected officials should not be punished for doing their jobs, especially when doing so means confronting uncomfortable truths. She reminded the public that democracy thrives not when voices are muffled, but when they are allowed to rise in defense of justice. What's more, Crockett's pivot exposed the fragility of the institutions that attempt to hide behind authority. The judge may have held the legal power to issue a fine, but it was Crockett who held the narrative power, and she wielded it masterfully. By the next day, news outlets were running headlines about judicial overreach, systemic bias, and the broader implications of targeting elected officials for their speech. She didn't just survive the attack, she turned it into a strategic win. In doing so, Jasmine Crockett reaffirmed why she's become one of the most compelling political figures in Washington. It wasn't just that she stood her ground. It's that she turned the ground into a platform. The fine, intended to silence her, became a microphone. And with it, she reminded everyone watching that power isn't just about position, it's about how you respond when it's challenged. Crockett's swift and unyielding response sent a message far beyond the courtroom. It was a bold declaration. If you come for her with baseless penalties, you'd better be ready for the backlash. She didn't just defend herself, she activated a movement. Community leaders, civil rights groups, and fellow lawmakers began speaking out in her defense, calling the judge's action not just punitive, but deeply political. They echoed her sentiment that this was an abuse of power meant to suppress a woman who had dared to speak unapologetically, especially in spaces where voices like hers have historically been marginalized, and while many in her position might have chosen a private settlement or a quiet legal appeal, Crockett knew the stakes were bigger than a courtroom technicality. She took control of the narrative publicly, holding media interviews and town halls where she broke down exactly how the fine came about and what it really represented. She linked her experience to the broader patterns of institutional suppression, connecting the dots between what happened to her and what happens to countless Americans when they challenge authority. Her words resonated, not just with her constituents, but with a national audience hungry for authenticity and backbone in politics. She didn't hide behind legalese or vague statements. She laid it all out, plain and direct. In doing so, she exposed a key truth. Those who hold power are often threatened not by disobedience but by clarity and conviction. But Crockett didn't stop there. She leveraged the momentum to introduce a legislative proposal aimed at protecting elected officials and whistleblowers from retaliatory fines or sanctions that lack transparency and due process. The proposed bill, while still in early stages, already has co-sponsors and a growing base of public support. It's another example of how she transforms conflict into opportunity, using pressure not to retreat, but to push for reform. Meanwhile, the judge at the center of the controversy has come under scrutiny. Legal analysts and watchdog groups have begun calling for reviews of similar past actions, questioning whether this kind of financial penalty has been wielded as a political tool before. What was once a quiet ruling tucked away in legal files has exploded into a conversation about judicial accountability and the checks on those who are supposed to be neutral arbiters of justice. In the days following the incident, Crockett's profile has only risen. Media outlets now call her a force of political resilience, and grassroots organizations see her as a symbol of what it looks like to fight back and win. Not with anger alone, but with strategy, grace, and unshakable purpose. She could have paid the fine and moved on. Many expected her to. Instead, she transformed the moment into a battlefront and won it with poise and fire. Jasmine Crockett showed not only that she can take the heat, but that she knows how to turn it into power. The judge tried to silence her, but all he did was give her a bigger stage, and she made sure the whole nation heard her voice. Now Crockett stands not just as a representative from Texas, but as a national symbol of resistance, a woman who refused to bow to pressure and instead exposed the cracks in a system that often punishes truth-tellers more harshly than the corrupt. What was meant to humble her only heightened her reach. In congressional chambers and news interviews and across social media, her words now carry more weight, sharpened by experience and fortified by resolve. Opponents who once underestimated her now move cautiously, aware that she isn't easily cornered. Allies have grown louder, emboldened by her example, and voters, particularly young, progressive, and historically disenfranchised communities, see in her something rare. A politician who not only talks the talk but walks into fire with her head high, refusing to flinch even when the system pushes back. It's not lost on anyone watching that this battle is about more than just Crockett. It's about how institutions react when their authority is challenged by someone they can't control. A black woman with a legal mind, a sharp tongue, and no tolerance for political theater. She embodies everything the old guard fears. And when they tried to penalize her for it, she flipped the penalty into proof of their fear. The fine, though, still officially on the books, has become almost irrelevant in the larger picture. Crockett's legal team is pushing back through the proper channels, and there's a strong likelihood it will be overturned or dismissed on appeal. But win or lose in court, she's already won in the court of public opinion. Perhaps most notably, she's used this moment not to seek sympathy, but to galvanize action. In one recent interview, she said, "If they can try this with me, someone with a legal background, a seat in Congress, and a platform, imagine what they're doing to everyday people who don't have any of those things." That line struck a nerve. It reframed her experience not as an isolated injustice, but as a reflection of a much larger, deeply entrenched problem. And that's the true turning of the tables. What started as an attempt to punish her has become a national conversation about race, gender, power, and accountability. Crockett didn't just react. She redirected the narrative. She turned the fine into a flashlight, shining it on the murky practices of those who operate behind closed doors with impunity. Every step she's taken since has been deliberate, smart, and grounded in something bigger than herself. And that's why the attempt to silence her backfired so dramatically, because they mistook her as an individual threat, not realizing she was the voice of many. When they tried to quiet her, they amplified her instead. When they tried to shame her, they crowned her with credibility. Jasmine Crockett walked into a courtroom with a target on her back and walked out with a movement behind her. The judge may have held the gavel, but she held the truth, and that proved to be far more powerful. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of that moment in the courtroom only continued to grow. Jasmine Crockett's name became synonymous with standing firm against institutional overreach. Activist groups began citing her case in workshops and rallies. Legal scholars dissected the fine, not just for its legal implications but for what it revealed about the evolving dynamics between the judiciary and elected representatives who refused to conform. The media couldn't get enough. Every major outlet, from cable news to independent podcasts, wanted her insight. But Crockett wasn't content with just telling her story. She used her newfound platform to uplift others who had been targeted by similar abuses. Whistleblowers, community organizers, even fellow lawmakers began coming forward, inspired by her courage and clarity. She didn't just defend herself, she built a coalition. Her team launched a digital campaign under the banner, "We Won't Be Silenced," spotlighting cases of political retaliation and pushing for national safeguards against judicial overreach. The campaign included legal resources, storytelling platforms, and direct advocacy initiatives. Within weeks, the movement gained tens of thousands of supporters, including lawyers, activists, and ordinary citizens who had long felt powerless in the face of arbitrary authority. Crockett's opponents tried to paint her as radical, combative, too aggressive for the role she holds. But those narratives fell flat as more people saw what she truly represented. Bold, informed leadership with an unwavering moral compass. She didn't break rules, she broke silences. And in doing so, she reframed what leadership can look like in an era where political courage is often in short supply. In private, those close to her say this fire was always there. The courtroom moment just gave the world a reason to pay attention. And now that they are, she's making every second count. She's introducing new legislation, building broader alliances, and setting the tone for a new generation of public servants who are tired of playing by rigged rules and ready to challenge the systems that preserve them. What makes her stand out isn't just her defiance, it's her discipline. Every action she's taken since the fine has been precise, intentional, and bigger than personal vindication. She's not fighting to prove a point. She's fighting to change the terms of the fight itself. And that's what makes her dangerous. To those who tried to silence her in the first place, Jasmine Crockett didn't just endure the fine, she exposed its roots, weaponized its message, and transformed it into fuel. She reminded everyone watching that silence is not strength and that dignity doesn't come from compliance, but from the courage to speak even when the cost is high. So while the judge may still hold his bench, it's Crockett who holds the floor, now. And from that floor, she's not just speaking louder, she's speaking for many, and they're listening. As her story continued to unfold, Crockett's defiance evolved into a blueprint, an actionable model for resistance against systems that too often punish transparency and suppress dissent. Her every step became a lesson in political agility and personal integrity. She wasn't just surviving adversity, she was using it to redraw the lines of power, forcing institutions to reckon with voices they once dismissed. The courtroom incident, once a blip in the news cycle, was now embedded in a broader cultural reckoning. Students studied it in law and political science classes. Civil rights groups cited it as a case study in modern-day political retaliation. But most importantly, everyday people, those who often feel powerless in the face of bureaucracy, saw in her a reflection of their own struggle, magnified on a national stage. Jasmine Crockett had become something rare in American politics, a truth-teller who couldn't be bought, broken, or bullied. She continued her legislative work with renewed purpose. Each policy she introduced now carried the weight of lived experience. She championed reforms that addressed judicial overreach, targeted fines, and abuses of discretion by those in positions of legal authority. Her proposals weren't just symbolic. They were rooted in the kind of reality most lawmakers never face themselves. That authenticity gave her efforts momentum and legitimacy. Inside Congress, her presence grew louder, more commanding. Colleagues who once overlooked her were now seeking her insight. She had become more than a rising star. She was a force of nature in the chamber, carving out a lane where justice, accountability, and courage were no longer negotiable. Her background as a civil rights attorney meant she knew the system from the inside out, and now she was using that knowledge not just to navigate it, but to disrupt it. The judge who had issued the fine, meanwhile, faced increasing scrutiny. Public interest groups filed ethics complaints, and calls for transparency around his past rulings grew louder. What was once an isolated act of judicial authority had morphed into a flashpoint, exposing cracks in the very system that had tried to penalize Crockett. The scales were beginning to tip, not just in her favor, but in favor of the broader movement her stand had ignited. But through it all, Crockett remained focused, not on revenge or personal victory, but on transformation. She spoke often about her roots, the communities she serves, and the people who never make the headlines but fight every day for dignity and fairness. It was never just about her. It was about all of them. She had taken a moment meant to shame her and turned it into a mirror for a nation that often looks away from injustice when it's dressed in official robes. She didn't just respond to the fine, she dismantled the silence that made it possible. In doing so, Jasmine Crockett reminded America that accountability isn't a threat to justice. It is justice. And when you come for someone armed with truth and conviction, you'd better be ready for the storm they bring with them. She was never meant to win that day in court, but she did. And in the process, she taught a lesson that will echo long after the gavel falls. You can fine her, but you will never silence her. As the political dust settled, it became clear that Jasmine Crockett had not only weathered the storm, she had reshaped it. Her confrontation with the judge had grown into a defining political moment, the kind that cements legacies. In town, halls, campaign rallies, and across social media, people weren't just talking about the fine anymore. They were talking about what it represented, the system's fear of unshakable voices and unfiltered truth. Crockett kept moving forward. She returned to Congress with her head high, her voice louder, and her mission clearer. No longer just a representative from Texas, she became a national figure for fearless governance, for speaking truth even when it's inconvenient, and for never allowing her identity as a black woman to be used against her as a weapon of control. Her presence in hearings was now met with a different kind of energy. Respect, yes, but also awareness. Those who once tried to steamroll her knew now. She pushed back harder. What made her different wasn't just her ability to fight, it was how she fought. With precision, with facts, with fire, and with a deep understanding that she wasn't just representing her district, she was carrying the weight of countless voices who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. Her power came not from position, but from purpose. The movement she sparked began to bear fruit. Her We Won't Be Silenced initiative expanded into community legal defense funds, mentorship networks for young activists, and legislative roundtables that brought marginalized communities directly into the policy-making process. She wasn't just telling people they had power, she was helping them build it. And the opposition? They tried to pivot. Some attempted damage control, claiming the fine wasn't personal, that it was standard procedure. But it was too late. The narrative had changed. What they meant as punishment had already become precedent, a public reckoning with how power is used to punish dissent, and how truth in the right hands can turn any penalty into protest. In private, Crockett's circle knew the toll it had taken. Standing up like that always comes at a cost. Threats, smears, fatigue. But she carried it all with grace, often saying, "If I don't take this on, someone with less protection will have to." She never asked for the spotlight, but once in it, she made sure it lit the path for others. She continues to remind the nation with every speech, every vote, every unapologetic moment of resistance. Democracy doesn't need silence. It needs sound. Clear, uncompromising sound from those who refuse to be cowed. Jasmine Crockett didn't just endure injustice, she transformed it. And in doing so, she etched her place in the American political story, not as a victim of power, but as a master of it. Because when they tried to fine her, they underestimated her. When they tried to silence her, they elevated her. And when they tried to stop her, they only helped build the stage she now owns. One unshaken, one undeniable, and one that echoes with the voices of every person who refuses to be quieted again. Now, as the months unfold, Jasmine Crockett's influence is no longer just reactive. It's strategic. The incident that was intended to derail her trajectory has instead solidified her status as a political architect of resistance. Her name surfaces not just in headlines but in organizing spaces, classroom debates, and grassroots campaigns. She has become a touchstone for those who refuse to compromise truth for comfort or position. But Crockett is not content to rest on symbolic victories. She knows real change lives in policy, in legislation, and in systems that outlast media cycles. She's pushing forward with a legislative agenda that addresses the very abuse she endured. Laws to prevent judicial overreach, transparency requirements for disciplinary fines, and federal protections for whistleblowers and elected officials under political fire. These aren't proposals rooted in theory. They come from the trenches, built on experience and designed to close the gaps that power often exploits. At the same time, she's mentoring a new wave of leaders, especially young Black women, encouraging them to enter law, politics, and advocacy without apology. Her mentorship isn't performative. She takes the time to meet with college students, community organizers, and up-and-coming candidates. She tells them the truth, that it won't be easy, that the backlash will come, but that it's worth it. And in her, they see proof that you don't have to dilute your voice to be heard. You just have to be ready to stand in it, even when it shakes the ground. Political analysts who once dismissed her as too bold or too combative now struggle to define her. They can't box her into old narratives or predict her next move. She plays by no one's script but her own, and that makes her one of the most dynamic figures in the current political landscape. Her popularity continues to rise, not because she seeks it, but because her authenticity makes her indispensable in a sea of safe, scripted politics. Meanwhile, the judiciary that sought to penalize her faces continued calls for oversight and reform. Civic organizations have filed formal complaints. Public hearings are being discussed. What once seemed like a routine fine has become a watershed moment in the fight for judicial accountability. Crockett's confrontation with the court didn't just expose one judge. It peeled back layers of unchecked authority and gave people a framework for challenging it. But perhaps the most powerful part of Crockett's story is how deeply personal it remains. She often speaks of her upbringing, of her community, and of the mentors who taught her to never trade truth for temporary safety. She draws strength from that foundation, and it's that grounding, more than any office or title, that gives her resilience. Her story isn't just about survival or success, it's about responsibility to the people who believe in her, to the systems she's determined to reform, and to the future she's helping to shape, one bold, unflinching step at a time. What began as a moment meant to intimidate her has become the fuel for a long, intentional march toward justice. Crockett has moved from target to trailblazer, from defendant to definer of the rules. And through it all, one truth remains undeniable. When they tried to silence her, they forgot one thing. Jasmine Crockett doesn't speak just for herself. She speaks for everyone who refuses to be silenced. Ever again. Today, Jasmine Crockett's voice rings louder than ever, not in defiance but in declaration. She's no longer merely reacting to injustice. She's shaping the agenda. What began as an effort to humble her with a $15,000 fine has backfired into a catalytic moment of national consequence. Her presence in the political arena now carries a different weight, the weight of a woman who has not only endured the storm, but redirected its winds. Crockett moves through the halls of Congress with calm intensity. Her speeches are studied. Her votes are scrutinized. Her interviews trend not because they're dramatic, but because they cut through the noise with a rare kind of moral clarity. Her rise hasn't been powered by scandal or showmanship. It's been built on consistency, courage, and an unshakable refusal to be told her place. Those who once viewed her as a disruptor now watch with caution, knowing she's not just a firebrand, she's strategic. She's turning pressure into policy, turning retaliation into reform. She's forcing a new conversation not only about what justice means, but who gets to define it. Behind the scenes, she's building, partnering with like-minded lawmakers, cultivating a staff that mirrors her values, diverse, community-driven, uncompromising. She's raising funds, not just for her own re-election, but for the broader causes and candidates that align with her vision: transparency, equity, and accountability. Her campaign offices now double as hubs for civic education, voter engagement, and policy workshops. In her world, power isn't hoarded, it's shared. What's perhaps most striking is how Crockett's influence has extended beyond politics. She's become a cultural figure, quoted in think pieces, invoked in protest chants, and honored by grassroots organizations from coast to coast. Artists paint murals of her. Educators assign her interviews as reading. Parents point to her when they tell their children what courage looks like. She's more than a lawmaker now. She's a living symbol of resistance, resilience, and renewal. Yet through all the accolades, Crockett stays focused. She often says she doesn't want to be exceptional. She wants to make it normal for people like her to stand in power without compromise. That's the revolution she's quietly advancing. One where truth-tellers aren't punished, where authority is questioned without fear, and where the system can no longer mute those it was never designed to protect. As the judge's gavel fades into the background, Crockett's legacy is still being written by the policies she pushes, the lives she lifts, and the silence she's shattered for good. She didn't just survive the attempt to silence her. She transformed it into momentum, into legislation, into a movement. And if there's one truth that rings clear through it all, it's this: Jasmine Crockett was never the one on trial. The system was, and under her unwavering gaze, it's finally being forced to answer. Even now, as time puts distance between that explosive courtroom moment and the present, the fire Jasmine Crockett lit shows no signs of fading. If anything, it's burning brighter, illuminating a path forward for a generation of leaders who are no longer willing to shrink themselves to fit into the mold of acceptable politics. The fine may have been the spark, but Crockett's conviction is the fuel. She's not coasting on outrage or applause. She's laying down infrastructure, redefining what long-term political change looks like when it's powered by those who've been historically locked out. In committee meetings, she's relentless. In community forums, she's accessible. In interviews, she's clear and cutting, never letting her message be softened or reshaped to suit a mainstream that too often forgets its margins. Her political identity has become inseparable from her refusal to conform. She's not here to play the game better. She's rewriting the rules altogether. And in doing so, she's showing other rising voices that dignity and disruption are not opposites. They are, in fact, the new gold standard. Opponents now tread carefully. Gone are the days when they could dismiss her with smirks or procedural tricks. Crockett has not only learned the system, she's mastered it. And she uses that mastery not to protect her own position, but to dismantle the barriers that block others. Every bill she writes, every question she asks from the dais, and every fiery floor speech she delivers serves the same mission: building a democracy that cannot be silenced. Meanwhile, the communities that sent her to Congress are watching with pride and with power. They see someone in Washington who doesn't just speak their language but speaks for them. And they see someone who will not back down when cornered, who will not retreat when punished, and who will not play small when the stakes are high. And still, Crockett remains grounded. She walks through her district like she always has, shoulder to shoulder with the people. She visits schools, churches, community centers, not as photo ops, but as checkpoints. Constant reminders of why she fights and for whom. Every injustice she faced, the fine, the threats, the pushback, only deepens her resolve. Because Crockett knows the truth. Power without purpose is empty, and silence in the face of oppression isn't neutral, it's betrayal. So no, she doesn't apologize for being bold. She doesn't tone it down for comfort. She doesn't play politics the way it's always been done, and that's exactly why she's winning. Not just in votes, but in hearts, in minds, and in momentum. Jasmine Crockett turned a $15,000 fine into 1 million voices rising behind her. She stood up, spoke out, and flipped the script on a system that never expected her to fight back. And now she's not just part of the conversation. She is the conversation. The echo of that gavel may have faded, but her voice, it's just getting started. As her momentum continued to build, Jasmine Crockett reached a point few politicians ever do. She transcended the moment and became a movement. What started as a single act of defiance in a courtroom had rippled outward, galvanizing a new generation of lawmakers, organizers, and everyday citizens who saw in her not just representation, but revolution. The legislative victories followed. Crockett's proposals to curb judicial overreach passed through committee with bipartisan backing, proof that when the message is rooted in truth and delivered with integrity, even opponents take notice. Her reforms weren't sweeping in name but in impact. Protections for elected officials under threat, financial transparency and punitive measures by public institutions, and increased access to legal defense for whistleblowers. Each one carved a piece off the machinery that once tried to silence her. But it wasn't the bills alone that defined her legacy. It was the culture shift. Staffers in Congress began referencing the Crockett effect, a term for when someone calls out injustice. Without waiting for permission, women of color running for office cited her as the reason they believed they could run without compromise. Legal associations hosted panels discussing how the courtroom isn't just a place of justice. It's often where power tries to hide behind procedure. And now, because of Crockett, more people are watching. The judge who fined her? He faded into quiet obscurity, his name now remembered more as a cautionary tale than a respected authority. No public apology ever came, and none was needed. Crockett didn't require validation from the very system she exposed. Her vindication was in the lives she changed, the voices she lifted, and the silence she shattered. As the next election cycle approached, she stood before a packed town hall, not to defend herself but to report back. She shared her wins, acknowledged the battle still ahead, and reminded everyone present that her rise wasn't just hers. "I didn't make it through that fire alone," she said. "Y'all pushed me forward, and now we push together." She ended her remarks not with a promise but with a challenge. "They tried to find me into silence. But now I ask you, what will you do with your voice?" The crowd erupted, not just in applause but in understanding, because Jasmine Crockett had shown them what was possible when fear was replaced with fire, and when power wasn't hoarded, but shared. And so the story ends not with a verdict, but with a beginning of a new chapter in American leadership, one where justice is loud, truth is unflinching, and silence is no longer an option. Jasmine Crockett didn't just beat the system. She made it answer to her.